Today, something a bit different. We're testing games on Apple M1 with MoltenVK support. What is MoltenVK? MoltenVK is a layered implementation of Vulkan 1.1 graphics and compute functionality. It basically allows Vulkan applications to run on top of Metal on macOS. Metal uses the shading language MSL, while Vulkan uses SPIRV. MoltenVK automatically converts a game's SPIRV shaders to their MSL equivalents. To provide Vulkan capability to macOS, MoltenVK uses Apple's publicly available APIs, including Metal. Developers interested in Mac or Apple Silicon should always aim to support Metal entirely, but MoltenVK is a good stepping stone. That being said, once developers understand Metal, it is an even more mature API compared to Vulkan, given that Apple uses it for all of its hardware including iOS and macOS devices. The debugging, profiling, and validation tools are also geared towards pure Metal and might behave strangely or show inconsistent results with MoltenVK games. For reference, all games have been played on a 13-inch MacBook Pro. To my knowledge, DOTA 2 was the first macOS game to support Vulkan through MoltenVK back in 2018. DOTA 2 is best experienced with a frame rate over 45 FPS, 60 plus if you're playing competitively. To help with this, Valve were testing the waters to see what the benefits were with Vulkan over OpenGL. Vulkan should be enabled by default these days, but you can switch between these APIs in the settings menu. At 1080p and best looking quality, the performance between OpenGL and Vulkan is actually not that much different, both seeing anywhere from 40 to 50 FPS. It's not until you lower the graphics quality a little that we start to see a dramatic difference in frame rate. Unfortunately, my FPS measurement tool can't track frame rates over 60 FPS just yet, so for now, here I'm showing the Steam inbuilt FPS counter. As you can see, OpenGL is staying between 50 to 58 FPS, while Vulkan is typically getting a bit over 75 FPS. Before Metro Exodus was native on Mac in April 2021, M1 users had to play the game via Crossover 20. It was playable at times, sure, but it was not the most enjoyable experience, let's be honest. The native Rosetta 2 version of Metro Exodus on Mac uses a custom workflow to translate render commands into Metal API commands, which you'll find is quite common for cross-platform games like this one. 4A Games and the Apple Metal engineering team actually worked together on this one to optimize it for both Intel and M1 Macs via MoltenVK and the Metal framework. While the translation layer 4A used is optimized for Metal, they ran into issues when these two complex systems come together in practice. Apple said they used Xcode's Metal debugger to give us an insight into the game's performance and how 4A's frame graphs are structured and how they used Metal System Trace in instruments to learn about a game's performance over time. Metro Exodus on Apple M1 has been optimized for 1080p, medium settings, and 30 FPS. This performance is on par with the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One version. If you have VSync disabled, you can also get up to 50 FPS in some scenes. 1080p high is not advised right now, as the frame rate will drop into the mid-20s and the time the GPU spends doing one frame is worse. Final Fantasy XIV Online offers a Mac version from the game's website. This is not a native Mac application though, as it is running in a customized version of Wine. Square Enix worked with code weavers to update the port of Final Fantasy XIV on Mac. they used MoltenVK to provide Square Enix a 64-bit application with support for D3, D11 features, such as tessellation. Despite the fact that I have absolutely no idea how to play this game, it's fair to say the performance is playable, or acceptable. It's not amazing, but considering how this isn't even a native application, I think it's impressive. At 1080p high, you'll get around 40 FPS on average, and medium 50 FPS. Codeweavers had great success with Final Fantasy XIV that they recently integrated MoltenVK into Crossover. You can run games using DXVK, which is a Vulkan-based translation layer for D3, D11 titles, without installing another OS. This includes all the Dark Souls games. Dark Souls Remastered can be played at 1080p max settings and gets 60 FPS on average. Sometimes it will drop to the low 50s, and there can be a few lag spikes when initially engaging with an enemy, but it's nothing game-breaking, and I don't imagine many of you will notice it without this FPS measurement tool that I'm using. Crossover also has controller support now, which is very important for a Souls-like game. Dark Souls 3 is currently supported on M1 via the Crossover 21 nightly build. On M1, it plays much like the baseline PS4 version. 900p resolution, medium settings, and 30 to 45 FPS, it varies. It's not nearly as enjoyable as Dark Souls Remastered, as these games are much better played at 60 FPS for the combat especially, but this performance, in my opinion, is very exciting. I hope From Software see that there is a potential here and consider working on a native port for these games. Maybe they could work with Alvarez, who ported Baldur's Gate 3 and Divinity Original Sin 2 to Mac. MoltenVK is also very helpful to bring classic games back to macOS, such as Doom. GZDOOM is a 3D accelerated Doom source port based on ZDOOM. It was previously powered by OpenGL 4.1, but it is now powered by Vulkan. The developer said, with the exception of Triangle Fan's workaround, we had no issues with it. It's also the only example I can find right now of an ARM64 application with Vulkan support. There is honestly no difference in performance with running the game on OpenGL, but running it on MoltenVK is the best option right now to ensure it's playable for more years to come, as OpenGL, as we all know, is deprecated. Aerofly FS2 Flight Simulator is what you'd expect it to be, a flight simulator. You can fly around Earth and take control of 22 iconic aircrafts. It doesn't have the graphical or gameplay polish of X-Plane 11 or Microsoft Plane Simulator, but it's still fun, and a cheaper alternative, I suppose. The developer, iPax, said using MoltenVK on macOS has been great and has better performance than OpenGL and saves them a lot of time to maintain yet another rendering backend. The only issue right now is that the GPU can hang from time to time, but it doesn't occur very often, and the performance is still quite impressive considering how M1 has to show so much here in this world, which is Earth. Unlike the Windows version, Path of Exile on macOS only offers Vulkan as the default renderer. This may have been the reason on why the game was unplayable on M1 up until it was patched in April 2021 for Rosetta 2 and MoltenVK. However, it still had issues with textures flickering. This has since been fixed, at least from what I've seen. At max settings in 1080p, the game sees anywhere from 35 to 55 FPS. When multiple foes are on screen, this is when it will have a big effect on the performance. What I found was if you put shadows from ultra to high, this will dramatically improve the performance and you'll get almost a locked 60 FPS and a stable frame time. Raft is an open-world survival game that has become quite popular since its release in 2018. It's another D3, D11 game running through DXVK Vulkan backend through Crossover 20. I don't suggest playing this one at 1080p, as the frame rate will be too low. Instead, play at 900p and good quality. You'll get around 30 FPS. Again, it's not amazing performance, but this game is quite slow paced, so this frame rate is actually playable, in my opinion. Elder Scrolls Online for Mac is the only Elder Scrolls game on Mac, and one of the most popular MMOs available. When the game was switched from OpenGL to Vulkan in 2019, it broke the game for several months. Since then, ZeniMax have been hard at work to optimize the game for Mac with MoltenVK. While ZeniMax have stated that they have no intentions to develop a native version for ARM-based Macs, the performance here is still acceptable. At 1080p high settings, it gets 30 FPS on average. Or you can play at 1080p medium settings and get 30 to 40 FPS, or 900p medium and 45 to 50 FPS. The main reason that a native version is not coming is that there is not a large enough Mac user base to warrant it, which is honestly the case for most games on Mac, whether they be native M1 or just native in general. Recently, Celeste was updated for M1. You see a couple of components of its game engine were outdated and did not support Apple Silicon. This is the case for many 2D games on Mac that still run on OpenGL. MoltenVK allows developers to continue supporting this new architecture without relying entirely on Metal for the time being. Right now, the game gets 60 FPS on average, but may drop a few frames when jumping or when you die. But I don't expect you'll notice it without seeing this video. Like Dota 2, DOTA Underlords was one of the first games to have MoltenVK support on macOS. Unlike Dota 2, however, Vulkan is the default engine. The game runs fairly well at 1080p best looking settings. If you want 60 FPS always, you will need to lower the settings just a tad. I have no idea how to play this game, so I won't say much else to save myself from embarrassment. Released on Mac in early 2021, Transport Fever 2 lets Mac users build their own transport empire. The developer said they didn't want to support OpenGL on Mac. Instead, they used Vulkan as it can lead to significant rendering performance improvements over OpenGL. The developer, Urban Games, optimized M1 via Rosetta for the x86 build. While there are no major stability or performance problems, the game is not really capable of 1080p. It's best played at 900p medium settings to get 30 FPS. This should improve when the native ARM build comes, but as we all know, third-party libraries are not currently supported on Apple M1. Jupiter Hell is a turn-based shooter from the depths of cosmic hell. When Apple deprecated OpenGL, the developer was worried about this game being supported on macOS, as it was built for OpenGL. Thankfully, MoltenVK was announced around the same time, I believe, so the developer could still support macOS for the foreseeable future. It's not the most graphically advanced game, so it should be no surprise that it plays just fine here at 1080p max settings and 60 FPS. Our last game is another D311 game running through DXVK Vulkan backend via Crossover 20. At 1080p medium settings, the game is getting 30 to 45 FPS, and at 900p high settings, the game is getting 30 FPS. Even at 900p medium settings, it still struggles to get over 40 FPS. Look, yes, this is not an ideal frame rate, especially for this type of first-person shooter, as it's best played at 60 FPS or over, because of all the fast-paced combat. But nevertheless, in my opinion, it's still impressive, because it's far from being a native application, as it's running through so much just to be playable here. Fun fact, the original 1997 Shadow Warrior had a Mac version, and the follow-up, 2013 game, also had a Mac version. Shadow Warrior 2 also had a Mac version in the works way back in 2015, but it was sadly cancelled. What do you think of this performance with MoltenVK on Mac? I noticed there is almost no information for this topic online, and I thought it would be a fun and educational video for you, the gamers, and also developers interested in working with Apple Silicon or Apple M1. Anyway, if you found this video useful or interesting, leave a like as it was a big project to work on, and subscribe, and turn on notifications, as this is the best place to stay up to date with everything Apple M1, Apple Silicon gaming related. My name is Stewie, and thanks for watching.